On the name of Deputy Daly.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, I'm wondering whether you've had any discussions with the Minister for Defence regarding the problems of pay and retention and recruitment. I note he did manage to wrestle an extra $37.5 million from you in the defence budget, but when we see that only $6 million of that went on pay, it really puts the issue into perspective, particularly when the Gardaí got $60 million extra to deal with pay. You see the scale of the problem. So I'm wondering, do you think it's sensible that the Defence Forces would spend 6 times the amount on capital expenditure than they would on pay?
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
As the Deputy will be aware, the Public Service Pay Commission has been asked by Government to examine the issue of recruitment and retention in the public service, and to establish in the first instance whether and to what extent a difficulty may exist in terms of recruitment and retention in respect of specific groups, grades and sectors of the public service. Where a recruitment or retention difficulty is identified, the Pay Commission is tasked to examine the full range of causal factors. It is important to point out that the terms of reference for the Pay Commission for this exercise, as agreed by the parties to the Public Service Stability Agreement, do not provide for a generalised pay review for any group. The Pay Commission emphasised this point in its first module report on nurses, non-consultant hospital doctors and consultants. The Commission is approaching its work in a modular format, having recently completed Module 1. The next phase, which is to say Module 2, will focus on certain other areas of the health service and our defence forces. The early inclusion of the defence forces in the Pay Commission schedule of sectors is to be examined under the terms of remit. Under the terms of its remit is welcomed and was welcomed both by myself and by my colleague, the Minister for Defence. I can further inform the Deputy that it is the position that officials from my department are in close liaison with their colleagues in the Department of Defence in the preparation of materials for further submission to the Pay Commission on the issues of recruitment and retention. The Pay Commission will, having due regard to its terms of reference, consider the matter of recruitment and retention in the Defence Forces and issue its findings accordingly. And I look forward to receiving their report.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Daly.
I am, of course, aware of the Pay Commission, Minister. I'm also acutely aware of the fact that our Defence Forces personnel don't have a collective voice the way normal workers organised in a trade union would have, and there is an extreme urgency in this situation. We're operating against the backdrop of a massive 21% reduction in Defence Forces personnel, a huge increase in workload, and actually a third of the people leaving in the last 5 years have bought their discharge. That's how desperate they are to get out. And it has become a bit of a paradigm in terms of austerity, in that when you cut back, it actually costs you more than you save. Because in the Navy, for example, to train someone, it costs around $100,000 to train somebody to able seaman level. And when they leave, you can't replace that expertise. And that's the crisis that we particularly have now. And against the backdrop where we're spending multiples of that on shiny new ships that we can't afford to staff, it does seem a bit ridiculous that we're wasting money on equipment in that regard. So there's a huge urgency here in addressing these matters, because it's not just about pay, the reasons why people are leaving.
Sorry, Minister. Excuse me. Burton, please.
I had a question down on this point, which was unfortunately transferred, so I want to take the opportunity to ask the Minister if he appreciates that there are serving members of the Defence Forces who, because their pay is so low, are qualifying for the Working Family Tax Credit, or the Family Income Supplement as it was called. And this is a mark of why morale is so bad in the Defence Forces, and that people are being offered jobs outside, leaving a career that they love and that they have served their country so well and so proudly. And Minister, what I want to ask you is, it used to be the norm all over Ireland that a soldier at corporal level with a family could look forward to buying an affordable house That's all gone out the window. And this government has shown no imagination to make provision to assist members of our defence forces who do us proud in Ireland and right around the world to actually become owners of an affordable house.
Thank you.
Instead, they're out there competing at the moment in the rental market in a regime of savage rent increases. No wonder they're leaving.
Thank you, Deputy. As Deputy Burton in particular will be aware, and I know Deputy Daly has a lot of experience in this area as well, the way in which we manage public sector wage and allowance policy is via a collective agreement. Any change that is made or considered for the Defence Forces therefore has immediate consequences for the rest of those who work in our public and civil services. And we also had this debate a few moments ago with Deputy O'Brien in relation to those who work in our nursing and midwifery services. Deputy Daly specifically put to me the issue in relation to why the Department of Defence and the Armed Forces have got increased funding for capital. I would have thought increased funding for their equipment, for their vessels, for their vehicles is something that would be welcomed, particularly given that the Department and some of the Armed Forces have been calling for that. In relation to the point that Deputy Burton put to me, I want to reiterate that we have a collective wage agreement overall. The value of this, I think, is still understood by the Labour Party. In relation to the figures in relation to that, I want to say, as I have said about the nurses, that I have nothing but the highest of respect for the contribution that our armed forces make at home, on the seas and further abroad.
Thank you.
In relation to, just to offer one concluding figure in relation to it, for a newly qualified three-star private and their naval service equivalent, after approximately 29 weeks of training, their salary at that point stands at €27,257, including the military service allowance. So in the debate in relation to allowances or salary, I think it's important to have that point in mind.
Thank you. Deputy Daly.
Thanks, Chair. I'm sure you find it ironic, Minister, to be criticised by your former colleagues for the policies that you brought in together, but such is the life in here. Increased capital expenditure would, of course, be welcomed if we had the staff to operate it. And the point is that the staff and the personnel are being bled dry and are leaving in droves, so we don't have the personnel to operate that. And restoring, as we're often told, pay to pre-FEMPI levels isn't really good enough. You know, it doesn't address the situation of post-2011 recruits or the cost of living issues. And that explains some of the problems that are being experienced. So small increases in pay, when you operate against the increased workload that a smaller number of Defence Forces personnel are expected to shoulder, then you see that actually the hourly rate is plummeting and the amount of time people have to stay away from their families. They don't have the protection of the Working Time Act or all of these things which make it a very family unfriendly situation. They don't have the same security of tenure as other public sector workers. In fact, they have to reapply after every number of years and so on. So we have a critical situation. And if we are talking about prudency in the management of our financial resources, then investing in staff is far more cost effective than in shiny new toys when we don't have the personnel to operate them.
Minister, please.
I feel I do have to correct the Dáil record slightly to say that a new tank or vessel is anything but a toy, and it is meeting an equipment need that has been raised with me by the Department of Defence and originating, of course, in the armed forces. So when it's anything but that, and at the very least, of course, it contributes to ensuring the safety of the personnel that Deputy Daly is referring to. The Deputy, I think, was very clear on what she is looking for there. The Deputy wants us to go to a wage level that's higher than where we were before the implementation of FEMPI. So they are wage levels that were even higher than they were before the difficulty we got into. And the point I'd put back to the Deputy, and I know you will have ways in which this can be paid for, is that it is overall a wage bill for our public services that will ultimately compromise our ability to deliver services, ultimately compromise in our ability to deliver in all of the other things that I've been called on to do over the last 45 minutes that I've been in here. What I'm committed to doing is standing behind the work of the Public Service Pay Commission to see can they yield recommendations that can be delivered while maintaining an overall collective wage agreement. And I'll conclude by reaffirming again the great respect that I have for all those in uniform who represent our state at home and abroad.
Thank you. Sorry, Deputy. Deputy, please. Okay, Deputy, we now move to